In the other videos so far, you've seen that Flexbox is great for full page layouts. But what you might not be aware of is that unlike 12-column grid systems, Flexbox is also perfect for building small layouts. Flexbox works well with these layouts because it's easy to make them fill up the space that contains them, so you can reuse them anywhere. The first layout we're going to be looking at is a credit card form. In this credit card form, you can see that we give a little bit of extra space for the credit card number and less space for the CVC. So let's start with the markup. One of the things you'll notice here is that I used a div with a class of field set instead of a field set. The reason why is because there's a bug in Chrome, Safari, and Firefox that prevents field set elements from being flex containers. Step 1 is to set the display of the inputs and buttons to block to make them fill up the full width of their containers. I like to do this as default in almost all of my projects because it makes those elements much easier to work with. The next step is to make the inputs inside the field set share a single line. You can accomplish this by making the field sets flex containers. The next step is to add some space between the inputs. The trick is to set the left and right margins of the field set's children and to remove them for the first and last children. Making the credit card number container wider is a little bit trickier. What we want is for it to be 3 times the width of the CVC container, which seems easy. However, if you remember back in Chapter 2, you also have to set the flex basis property of the container in order to compensate for the space between the inputs. And that's all it takes for a credit card form. One of my favorite form controls is the multi-button. Unlike a normal button, a multi-button is split into parts. When you click on a part, that part stays selected. Multi-buttons are an easy way to let people select from a short list of options. Your first instinct in building a multi-button might be to use button elements and use JavaScript to handle the selection. However, you can do this without JavaScript. There's another control that already has all the behavior you need. What is it? A radio button. When you select a radio button, the browser deselects the other related radio buttons. They already work with form submissions, and they're accessible out of the box. So how do you make a radio button look like a multi-button? The trick is to use the labels. One of the coolest things about labels is that you can click on them and they select their corresponding inputs. You can take advantage of this by making the label the button part of the multi-button. The first step is to hide the inputs. Next, we'll make the multi-button container and labels look like a button. Next, we'll move the labels onto the same line by making the multi-button a flex container. We can make each label the same width by using the flex property. Finally, in order to show which button is selected, we'll style the checked inputs labeled. This is easy with the adjacent sibling selector. And that's all there is to a multi-button. The last form control we'll be looking at is an attach button. An attach button is simply a button stuck to something else, like an input. They're handy for things like search fields. Like the multi-button, you need to make the search container a flex container. In the attach button, the button should be a fixed size and the input should stretch to fill the remaining space. We can use the flex property to achieve this. For the input, we'll set the flex grow and flex shrink to 1 and the flex basis to 0. With the button, we'll set flex grow and flex shrink to 0 and flex basis to auto. The last thing to do is to style the borders so that they look attached. And that's it. In this video, you've seen how Flexbox can be used to build all sorts of little controls. If you start thinking about HTML and CSS as small, reusable pieces, you'll learn to build components that can be used everywhere in your application. When you get to that point, your code will be lighter, more maintainable, and a joy to work with.